Thank you so much for joining me today, Representative Eleni Kavros DeGraw.
Thank you.
So I want to start with HB 8002 because you played such a pivotal role in its creation and its passage. You wrote a significant portion of the bill. Can you tell me first, just for people who may not know, like what it is to write a bill, what that process is like? How do you give input? Are you like, is what part of your staff is dealing with that? Just sort of give me a door into how that all works.
So I would say staff had significant hand in writing this. And I say that because our staff is really undersung in terms of the heroic work that they do with and for us. And so there were portions of this that came together on the Planning and Development Committee, and then there were portions of this that came together on the Housing Committee. And I would say, obviously the majority leader staff had a hand in this, the majority leader himself, both in the House chamber and the Senate chamber. So that means Jason Rojas and Bob Duff. So we had both of them working on this. And there were a lot of variety to the pieces. So I would say the piece that I worked on the most was the piece coming with advocacy from Desegregate Connecticut, now Pro Homes Connecticut, as we know. And then as a legislator, you decide what pieces you want to take, or perhaps what pieces you want to leave behind, maybe pieces that hadn't been thought of that you want to include. And then you work with your legislative lawyers, your LCO staff, in order to get the bill actually written. And it goes through quite the iterative process because sometimes there are, small errors. You could misplace a comma, which changes the entire meaning of a section. But there's also the feedback that we get from public hearings and from our colleagues that really helps determine what will end up in or out of that final bill. So we had quite the legislative process, especially with the work, live, ride aspect of 8002, because we heard that, for me, the bill for 3 years while I've been the House Chair of Planning and Development. And I think we calculated it was over 30 some hours of public hearing time that we actually had heard the bill. I think it's important for people to know that because there was a little bit of a narrative after the fact that the public was not terribly involved in these bills, when in reality, they were very involved in these bills.
You mentioned it's over the course of years that this bill has sort of taken form, been slightly modified, wording been changed. Ultimately, it garnered the support from the House and Senate and the governor. So that took people who were sympathetic to housing reform, who were not into it at first, and then voted for it. Can you tell me, because I know you've been, in this process since day one, what did that process of convincing people who understood that there's a housing crisis, didn't know exactly, okay, like this is the exact solution, and I don't know if I'm getting enough, like my constituents are telling me they don't want change. Like, what's that? Was there anything that made people click of like, oh, okay, we really do need to act?
I think the irony is that the constituents generally were saying, yes, we do need change. I mean, I don't know, I can't speak for all of my legislative colleagues, but I know every year that I send out my survey where I'm asking what some of the biggest issues are, affordable housing comes up quite a bit. Obviously, utilities are neck and neck sometimes for number one, but affordable housing is critical. And so I think that, the first year we ran, say, Work, Live, Ride, or we started talking about the fair share portion of the bill, it was really hard, and people were sort of listening to the minority of constituents who are against changing their towns, acknowledging that there is a need for more housing. And then we got into year two, and it started to be a little bit of, momentum. We actually passed Work, Live, Ride out of the House in year two of hearing it, which was really critical, I think, to ultimately getting it into that final 8002 and getting it across the finish line. I think that there are some folks who are never going to acknowledge that we're in a housing crisis. And I think that there are some folks who were brought along by a variety of factors, including the CBIA Foundation report. That's our Connecticut Business and Industry Association. And the fact that our employers were pleading with us as a legislature to do something in order to make sure that there's enough housing for employees to be able to live and work and thrive here in Connecticut. And so I think that that was an aspect. I also think just hearing from more and more constituents, the groundswell around the need for affordable housing, the fact that our homeless numbers keep increasing and that they've increased by such significant percentage over the last few years. And the fact that some people are, a medical bankruptcy away from themselves being homeless, or you see how the economy has been going. And while we might not be in the largest inflationary period of the last few years, certainly the inflation that we saw in and around COVID affected housing prices and food prices. And so these things all sort of have come together to create the, frankly, momentum that we needed in order to get a lot of this across the finish line.
So talk to me a little bit about this idea of change, because when you say, people, there's a small minority of people that did not want change, but then you see when we don't act, then
Right.
numbers of people experiencing homelessness skyrocket, then prices skyrocket, and neighborhoods can change without the policy governing them changing. Can you just talk to me a little bit about how does a lack of action perpetuate change?
It's ironic that when we talk to our kids, we talk about how prior planning prevents poor performance, right? We say this all the time. And yet, when you talk about wanting to plan communities, people sometimes get up in arms about that. It's like, oh, this is all about the planners, or this is all about the developers, or, you're in the pocket of the developers or the planners. I think it's kind of a ridiculous argument, honestly, when you think about the fact that good planning serves all of us. Good planning means that you've set aside open space so that you can have parks and recreation. Good planning means that you're not going to have as much traffic as you might if you didn't plan well. Good planning means that you've said, you know what, we're going to have townhouses here. We're going to have different kinds of multifamily over there. We're going to have single family homes. When you see a state like ours that has 91% all single family homes, that's an issue for everyone, because while people are chasing the dream of home ownership, and not everybody wants to own, many people do, but there are some people who don't want the responsibility of home ownership. But that doesn't mean that they are less invested in their communities. And so I think that when you think about the need for appropriate planning, that's really what a lot of this comes down to. If we didn't believe in appropriate planning, then we wouldn't have planning and zoning commissions. We wouldn't have town planners. We wouldn't have organizations dedicated to planning in order for us to have really thriving towns. And I think that that's something that has gotten lost in the discussion, is this need for effective and good planning.
Right. One thing you touched on there was open space, and I'd love to dive into that a little bit as it pertains to HB 8002 and transit-oriented communities. Because once again, we hear from an opposition, a minority that says that a bill like this is going to take away our open space, threaten our environment, not deal with things like climate change. When we talk about this is a solution. Can you tell me first sort of what the idea of transit-oriented communities entails, and then how HB 8002 actually implements that, and how that helps the environment?
So when we're talking transit-oriented communities, what we're talking about is density around transit or adjacent to transit. We are asking the towns themselves to say, this is where we would like for this density to be. And what that provides is more housing per, square foot, so to speak, square inch, square foot, square mile. And then that leaves space in other parts of the town for you to have open space. I have to tell you, I represent two communities, one that is more suburban and one that is more rural. There's nothing worse in my mind than saying, oh, we're going to go take away all this farmland that is in Canton, and we're going to put up all these apartment buildings. That is the exact opposite of good planning. And so when you think about the way that work, live, ride and transit-oriented communities are set up, not only are you empowering the towns to say, this is where we want it, we even set aside money to foster that. And then in addition, we said, you know what, we hear you. You're having trouble with sewer. You want to make sure that you have appropriate sewer for what you need. We put in a study for that. But it's ensuring that these areas are sort of designated and the other areas are protected. And frankly, it was wonderful to get the support of the League of Conservation Voters, because it was so easy to point to their support for the lack of destroying the environment. They would never have supported the bill if they thought that this was just going to increase the devastation that we see from our climate crisis. And if we are planning appropriately with transit-oriented development, that means that less people are using cars. We've spent all these years planning neighborhoods around cars. We should have been planning them around biking, walking, public transit. I love our rails to trails, but it did eliminate a lot of public transit when they took away those trains, right? The possibility of public transit, I should say. So I think that it's important that we are thinking both in terms of being environmental stewards as well as good planners, because they go hand in hand, and they are creating situations in which we can, ensure that this good planning actually takes care of our environment at the same time.
Right. It's about planning areas not for cars, but for people. In that vein, let's talk a little bit about parking reform. What does HB 8002 change, and why do we need parking reform? What are these strange things in our local, zoning that says, per one table in a restaurant, you need 2 parking spaces, or for bars, it'll say, per table. And it's like, whoa, is the government mandating drunk driving right now? Because I don't think that's a great idea.
Yeah, and especially you have to keep in mind, our world has changed, right? I think about when I was in college, there was no such thing as Uber or Lyft. And so you had to have a designated driver, and now you've got the possibility of Uber or Lyft. So you may not even have a customer parking at your establishment because they've been responsible enough to do a ride share, right? So
Yeah.
we have to change with the times. And that was part of what this whole parking section that came out of planning and development was about. Initially, we had set a different number, and people were unhappy with that, about saying that you couldn't require a certain amount of parking under X number of units. And now we've set it at 16 units. And the key here is we're allowing the towns to say, you could set up 2 areas where where you control the parking minimums and traffic districts and that sort of thing. And that's important. And I understand that. But I always use the example, again, in my own district. We have a shopping center that had been a golf course, and there was a lot of pushback when they initially decided to turn it into a shopping center. But, the land sold, and people get to do what they want with their land. And they built a Kohl's in one area of the parking lot. It happens to be a 2-story Kohl's. And the parking lot is very busy on the first story because it happens to be also near a grocery store, our ShopRite. And then there's a second story where there's actually another parking lot. And I always joke that the only time that parking lot ever gets used is when I'm teaching one of my children how to drive, because it's an empty parking lot and it's safe for them. They can't hit anything. So great place to teach them how to park, parallel and otherwise. But the ridiculousness of all of this asphalt that's not great for our climate and that's just sitting there, and that, frankly, that could have been infill housing. They could have put some housing up there that would have been amazingly adjacent to all of these wonderful stores and restaurants. And yet we have this really large, surface that's just parking, and it drives up the cost. When we're talking about housing, this extra parking really drives up the cost of housing. So if we're trying to make housing more affordable, we have to be engaged in the process of finding the things that we can make it less expensive, because we know when there's more expense, that's passed on to the consumer, who's us. But if we make it less, expensive for developers to go ahead and put in, instead of 2 parking places, 1 parking place. Some of the whole idea behind it was just getting our planning and zoning commissions to think more actively about, well, does this project really need this much parking? We're having a conversation now about childcare centers. Do childcare centers need as much parking as we're requiring? It seems a little silly because people aren't picking up at the same time. They're not necessarily dropping off at the same time, but yet we require so much parking. And again, that drives up the cost of childcare, because if you're building a facility, that drives up the cost of the facility, all this extra parking. So it's ironic how much parking actually touches so many aspects of a project that you just don't think about.
It really is incredible, and it intersects with so many of the other issues we've covered, including, foremost, affordability. So if these changes to Connecticut, if there was less mandated parking, if there was more infill development, if there was transit-oriented communities, for your communities of Avon and Canton, what would that look like, sort of viscerally? If you're like walking down the main street in one of these areas or going through like a commercial area, what would it mean for an individual to just be walking down the street in what's happening now versus what you envision?
In some cases, it's not going to change extraordinarily in terms of what you're seeing, other than you would probably see more people because, we're trying to put in more sidewalks in our communities so that people actually have access. We have Route 44 that runs both through Avon and Canton, and slowly but surely we've been adding more sidewalks as new development comes in, which is critically important for people to be able to actually walk from their office to get to, say, a fast food place or a restaurant. So in some cases, you may not see it. The other thing that's kind of interesting that we talked about in the bill is commercial conversion. And so we're not talking about the mom and pop stores. We're talking about these commercial spaces that have really changed after COVID. We had an office building that actually has been sitting empty since, I believe, right before COVID. And that is now being converted into 176 units, the majority of which will be affordable. That's critically important. But it happens to be right off of our Route 44 corridor, and it's tucked in the woods, so you might not see it. And the interesting thing, even more than that, is there's actually a tunnel that will connect to this apartment complex where people will be able to walk to our downtown Whole Foods and the stores that are around that. And
Wow.
That's what we are hearing more and more from people, especially our seniors who maybe don't want to have to keep a car and have to keep dealing with the insurance and the upkeep and the maintenance of a car, the ability to be able to walk to everything around them. The other thing you might see is when you do infill housing, again, we have a lot of things that, buildings that were former houses that then got turned into businesses, but then sit empty. That's an opportunity to put in maybe 4 little townhouses. And it would look visually so much cleaner. It would be within what we call the character of the town, even though we technically try not to talk about that anymore. It would be size appropriate for where it's being filled in. And you're giving more density so that it's not going into places where there isn't, where you're again eliminating farmland, which we don't want to do. So it's trying to be smart about existing properties as well as thinking about where new properties, might be able to come up. I think in Canton, it's a similar thing, making sure that when they're putting in apartments, they're planning and zoning on their own. Put in something that says from now on, you build apartments, 15% minimum have to be affordable. That's crucial for our towns. We want our teachers, our firefighters, our police officers to be able to live in the communities they serve. We want new families coming in to be able to use these wonderful schools. And having the conversation with people to explain that apartments do not mean your schools will be overburdened, that the data does not support that. These are all really important aspects of the conversation because there are so many misunderstandings about what it means to bring in housing. And it's important to remind people when we bring in more people, we do increase our tax base, which lowers the burden on everyone. That's really critically important because we're not always increasing exponentially the need for services when we bring in new folks.
Absolutely. One more part of HB 8002 that I'd love you to sort of walk me through is the increased state capacity. This is a bureaucracy at the state level, like communicating with one another. What does that do? Like, people might look at that and say, oh gosh, a bigger state, just what I asked for.
Yeah.
How does that help people?
Well, I think what you're really talking about is our new housing advisory council.
Yes.
And that's critically important because we do want people talking to one another. We want to try to speed up the processes so that we're still deep, for instance. If there's, something with a permit, you want to have that conversation go faster, not at the expense of having something happen badly, with the environment or say a brownfield or something, but making sure that we are having these non-siloed conversations because that seems to be a critical piece of this. The other piece is for the state to better understand the struggles of the town. Are you struggling with sewer? Is that a big part of your issue? Then we need to figure out how to help you with that, because there are towns that want to build, but they don't have the sewer capacity. So how
Right.
can we help them with some funding? How can we help them with connecting them with experts? We have towns that don't have full-time town planners. I think that's where you'll see the COGs will be very involved. The COGs are a large part of 8002. They were not so much when we had it as 5002, but I think empowering the COGs to have more capacity to work with the towns and to have these conversations. I think our biggest problem has been we have the conversations in silos, and then it sort of makes it easier to make the argument, well, that worked there, but it won't work here. When in reality, if you're tweaking things that worked someplace else, you probably can get there. And that's why this sort of regional approach, thinking in terms of what does the region need, that is more, I think, applicable to our situation. We hear about how hot the Hartford County housing market is, and we don't
Right.
really use county government. So here we have sort of this outside voice telling us how hot the market is, and yet we don't even use counties. But having sort of the state, the COGs, the towns all rowing in the same direction will be really critical. And I think that there's been a misunderstanding that it's like the state's coming in to tell you. That's not the case at all. The state is trying to better understand what are your needs and are there ways to help, or do we just need to get out of your way? And that's okay too. So I think that's where we're going to really land with all of this. And so much of 8002 that's critical is the implementation. And we're just going to start seeing that process begin very soon.
Right. I'd love to look forward. Just a last question, looking forward, looking at implementation and also looking at future efforts, future bills.
Yeah.
What are the things that you still say? Because we never want to, of course, like declare victory over the housing crisis. So how can a pro-homes movement on the outside, in the legislature, crafting these bills, continue to deliver and deal with the issues that you're seeing?
I think the first place is red tape, finding solutions to those red tape problems that we hear from our developers, and frankly, trying to free up our towns. There are pieces everybody gets it up in arms about as of right, but as of right is the town deciding what their rules are. We've done it for single family homes. There's no reason that we can't do that for other types of housing to make it a little simpler for the towns to be able to make decisions, right? I think making sure that people who are on planning and zoning commissions have really good planning skills, or at least they are trained to understand what they're looking at, because obviously we have town planners that literally have spent their lives, and then our planning and zoning commissions are typically volunteers. So we want to make sure that there's, some cohesiveness there so that our town planners are not, rubbing up against our planning and zoning commissioners who have to make these decisions. I think it's also important that we're thinking about ADUs and expanding, how we think about ADUs. We made it an option when we initially passed it in the legislature, frankly, because that was where the negotiation went. But there are many towns that decided to opt out. And I think that was a mistake in many ways, because ADUs can be so critical. I think we need to look at the owner occupancy aspect of ADUs. That might be something that we want to look at. There are some other factors there as well. And I think that, looking to other states to see what has worked there and how would that fit within our Connecticut narrative, I think that's also important. I always go back to homelessness, because we really have to be thinking cohesively about how do we get as close to zero as possible. Are there people who will never come in? Yes, there are people who will never come in from outside by choice, but we can get that number down to a very, very small number, in the same way that we ended veteran homelessness years ago. Yet we still, we see that number growing again, and we want to make sure that we are bringing these people in, but we have to be thoughtful. Are we converting motels? Are we looking at dormitory style living? What are the ways that we can address that? Because we have so many folks not transitioning into affordable housing or transitional housing. We have to find solutions there as well, because the bill that we just passed, that is not addressing homelessness in the immediate. So we have to be looking for those solutions at the same time. So I do hope that folks who are pro homes are also thinking about folks who are living on the street, living in our woods that we need to be helping as well, especially, as we are taping this today, it is practically sub-zero outside and we have in some places 2 feet of snow on the ground. So those folks can't be lost in this conversation. But I do hope that our pro-homes folks get louder and louder and make sure to attend your local planning and zoning commission meetings, or at least make sure you're engaged with what's happening in your town so that you can send an email and say, I'm for this project, not just I'm against this project.
Absolutely. And, because when you show up to those hearings,
Yeah.
it's usually the same crop. And unfortunately, the people with the time are usually the people with the means, and the people with the means usually want to maintain those means. And there's nothing wrong with people looking out for themselves, but it is truly up to us to make
And
sure
more
that there
homes does not
Yes.
mean that the value of your home has to go away.
Right.
Two
Right.
things can be true. It's not pie. We can all succeed. And I think that's what people have forgotten. I'll just close with a quick story that I often tell.
Absolutely.
My mom, single mom, if it hadn't been for the fact that there was a townhouse development getting put in near where we lived with my grandparents, I don't know when we would have gotten out of temporarily living with my grandparents for 8 years. And that townhouse enabled my mom to become a homeowner. It ultimately, when she got remarried many years later, it ultimately helped her buy another house with her new husband, my stepdad. Those are the kinds of success stories that we want to hear. But we did have to live with my grandparents for 8 years because even with child support and a good union job that my mom had, the housing prices, she wasn't able to make it work until she'd saved up enough money for a down payment. So we have to be thinking about folks that are in similar positions. And that's part of what drives me, is ensuring that everyone that wants an option to own a home is able to get that option.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this all. Thank you so much for your work. Thank you so much for today. Seriously, the clear way that you are communicating these issues delivers a real moral clarity about all of this that I just seriously respect. So thank you so much.